I remember the first time I ever saw a movie in church. Maybe you had the same experience. Up until then, movies were off limits, especially if you went to a Pentecostal church. I mean, movies were off limits. Don't do that. Lots of people snuck to the movie theater, didn't tell everybody. One time, Sonia and I, when I was in Bible college, we weren't supposed to go to movies, so we drove to Branson to go to a movie away from Springfield, and we ran into two other students at the movie theater. But anyway, we weren't supposed to go. But back in the day, it was really, really taboo. Lots of people didn't even have TVs in their home. You remember that? Going to a picture show, though, man, that was flirting with the devil right there. And I got to say, looking back on it now and seeing how much the world has changed, maybe they were onto something. Maybe they were. Imagine my shock when it was announced in the mid-'70s that we were going to show a movie at church. I couldn't believe it. I thought that was something we weren't supposed to do. I didn't know what to think. Of course, this movie was different than other movies. It was a Christian movie, and it was a low-budget, cheesy movie, but everybody was captivated by every moment of this movie. It was called A Thief in the Night. You remember A Thief in the Night? The idea of the movie was simple. It was urging people to be ready for the rapture. Jesus is coming back to take his church away. Nobody knows the day or the hour, so we'd better be ready. You better be ready. There was even a song in the movie by Larry Norman. You remember it? I wish we'd all been ready. There's no time to change your mind. The sun has come and you've been left behind. I have to say, that movie freaked me out a little bit. I was like 9 years old, and it rattled me. And again, I was a kid, so I took every word of this movie to heart. And I had a major fear of being left behind. I'd come home from school, and I'd say, Mom, I'm home. And if I didn't hear her say anything, I'd start looking through the house to find her. And if I didn't find her, oh no, the rapture has happened and I've been left behind. I would frantically run through the house, but she was usually in the backyard. Anybody else have an experience like that? I was afraid of being left behind. Why was I so scared? Why was I afraid? Was there gross sin in my 9-year-old life? No. Was I a bad kid? No. I loved God. I wanted to go to heaven. I wanted to serve him. But I didn't know how I could be sure. I didn't know how I could be sure that when the trumpet sounded that I would go. I don't know if kids still deal with that fear or not. My guess is they probably don't. After all, nobody really talks about the rapture anymore. When's the last time you heard a sermon in church on the rapture? When's the last time you heard a preacher talk about the end times? We don't talk about it much anymore. Why is that? I think one of the most obvious glaring reasons why we don't talk about it much in church is because most pastors feel utterly disqualified to talk about it. We don't feel qualified because there's so much disagreement. After all, there's not a consensus about the end times. There's people who love God and are very faithful to the scripture who have very different opinions about what's going to happen. After all, we're talking about the future, the unknown. You can listen to one video on YouTube and thoroughly be convinced of the position that they're presenting from their perspective, and then listen to another video and be thoroughly confused because that one sounded right too. And the other reason that you don't hear much about it is this. It's an uncomfortable subject. And we've learned to avoid uncomfortable subjects in church. We've learned not to talk about things that make people walk out feeling bad. We want people to walk out of church feeling like $1 million, so we avoid the topics that make them feel bad. People don't like to hear about things that stress them out or give them anxiety. But you know what? We need to talk about this. We can't neglect the topic because it's very important. And here's really the heart of the problem. This is why so many pastors feel unqualified to talk about it. There's so many different ideas and positions because the Bible's not very clear about what's going to happen. That's the truth. It doesn't tell us great detail about what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen. That's the truth. We're piecing together scriptures from different places in the Bible that were written hundreds and hundreds of years apart. And we're trying to piece together a narrative to understand. And part of it's the book of Revelation. Hello. I wish it weren't that way. That's the honest truth. I wish God had given us a really easy to explain or understand handbook for the end times. You know, like end times for dummies, because we could all use that, right? It'd be awesome. I'd love it if it were broken down by centuries and decades and it was color coded with tabs so you could easily flip to the part that you wanted to know. I'd love it if the book told us exactly how everything's going to play out. Okay, first there's going to be this guy and he's going to do this. But it doesn't do that, does it? And here's the simple thing that we all need to accept when we're talking about the end times. God didn't want us to have all the information up front. He didn't want us to know all the details. He didn't want us to have every fact and every piece of information. And in fact, here's what I've discovered about God. That's true of a lot of things in my relationship with God. He doesn't necessarily want to give me all the information up front. He doesn't want to give me all the details, because if I knew all the information about what was to come, I might not be up for the trip. If I knew everything that was going to happen, I might let fear take over and make my decisions for me. See, God wants us to trust in Him. He wants us to walk in faith no matter what we face, no matter how difficult it is. God's desire is for His children to walk in faith in obedience to Him. So my goal for this series is not to explain everything about the end times to you as some expert standing here revealing all my fount of knowledge on biblical truth when it comes to eschatology. Instead, I want to remind you of what Jesus said. I want to remind you of what He said and how I believe it relates to your life. So here we go. You ready? In the days just before Jesus was arrested, He and His disciples spent time in Jerusalem. He preached, He worked miracles, He declared Himself to be the Messiah, the promised one who was to redeem Israel, but they rejected Him. The leaders of the Jews plotted against Him. They didn't receive Him as Messiah. And on their way out of the temple, not too many days from when Jesus was arrested and crucified, the disciples pointed out the buildings. They were walking out of the temple, and the disciples pointed out the buildings to Jesus. And look what He said in Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when His disciples came up to Him to call His attention to the buildings. "Do you see these things?" He asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every stone, every one will be thrown down." This had to be alarming to the disciples, you know. I mean, this is the temple we're talking about. This is the centerpiece of everything they knew about God. It was the centerpiece of their faith. The disciples knew what it was to regularly go to the temple. It was the center of the religious world. What would their faith look like without the temple? What could Jesus mean by this? And the text goes on. Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to Him privately and they said, "Tell us." They said, "Tell us when this is going to happen and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age." And here's one of the first problems that arises when we're talking about the end times. The disciples didn't even know what questions to ask. Do you see that? They thought that if the temple was destroyed, that must be the end of the world. Because the only way God would allow the temple to be destroyed is this must be the end of it all. They couldn't even conceive that 2,000 years later, we'd still be waiting for Jesus' return. That wouldn't have been even in their remote thoughts. That would have been confusing and disheartening. So here's what Jesus said in response to them, and I think it's exactly what Jesus would say to us today. Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you." Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. Watch out that nobody deceives you. We live in confusing times, don't we? There's pressure on every side to shift our beliefs, to change our view of the world. But I believe that every single one of us who call Jesus Lord should prepare our hearts for what's coming. We should prepare our lives for the days ahead. We should stand firm in our beliefs and stand firm in our convictions. And here's what I want you to see. If you want to be ready for the last days, hold on to Jesus. If you want to be ready for the last days, hold on to Jesus. Hold on to him with all your might. That's where it starts. Jesus said, make sure that no one deceives you. Don't let anybody deceive you. Don't let anybody pull you off course. There are all kinds of confusing voices out there that are trying to do just that. They're ridiculing our beliefs. They're trying to cast doubt on what we believe. Oh, surely you don't still believe that after all that we've come to understand through science. But church, I want to remind you, we need to hold on to Jesus. You need to hold on to Jesus. If you're going to be strong in these days, if you're going to be ready for what is coming, hold on to Jesus with all your might. When the world pressures us to change our message, we have to hold on to Jesus. When your friends try to change the way that you look at sin and rebellion, hold on to Jesus. When your teachers and the skeptics in your life and in your family try to convince you that what you believe is foolish, they try to tell you, don't follow Jesus anymore. Don't believe that. How foolish can you be? Hold on to him with everything you've got. Don't let anyone deceive you. Hold on to Jesus. We live in a day when everyone seems to want to be an influencer. Have you noticed that? Everybody with an Instagram account or a YouTube page wants to be an influencer. And they're quick to want to get on their social media feeds and share all their wisdom, the keys to this and the secrets to this and that. Be careful who you listen to. Be careful what you entertain. Hold on to Jesus. Jesus went on. He said, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. But see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Does any of that sound familiar? Sounds kind of like the description of the nightly news, doesn't it? Every night we see the images of wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famine. We see and hear the stories about things happening in the earth, and it's only increasing. So what's the point that Jesus is making? I think it's this. You and I are going to go through a lot of things that could potentially shake our faith. We're going to go through a lot of things that could cause us to question whether or not God's plan is still in control. Does he really have his hand on me? Does he really see me? It's going to be a scary time. There's going to be a lot of chaos. But don't let any of that pull you off course. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Keep your faith strong. All of these things that are supposed to happen and that are happening right now in the world, they are all part of God's unfolding plan. He's in control. Praise God, he's in control. I know there's a lot of uncertainty in the world right now. I know there's so many people saying that bad things are on the horizon, and they're telling you how it's going to get worse and worse. But there's a comforting truth in that. Jesus already told us that it was going to happen. He told us, he gave us warning. He told us what to expect. You can know that God has his hand on this world because things are happening just the way Jesus said they would. That should give us great confidence as followers of Jesus. It should increase our confidence in the Scripture. It should increase our faith in what God's told us. When you feel like your world is spinning out of control and you wonder if God has forgotten you, when you wonder if God still sees us and is in control, don't you believe it for a second that God has forgotten you, because He is sitting on the throne in glory and He holds this world in His hand. He holds your life in His hand. God knows where you are. He knows where you are. He sees you. He loves you. And He's moving His kingdom forward day by day. Day by day. He's moving us forward. Trust in Him. Hold on to Jesus. Now, here's the tough part. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. This week, I was watching a popular Christian news show that I've heard a lot of people talk about. And I was intrigued when I heard one of the men on the screen say, we're going to take this nation back for God. We're going to take this nation back for Jesus. I was intrigued by what he was saying. That sounds great to me. Take this nation back for Jesus. What's the plan? What was He interested in doing? What was the plan to take the nation back? Was it a great ministry outreach that they were planning? No. He wasn't planning to take this nation back through a tour of revivals or street witnessing events. He wasn't launching a ministry to help the poor and addicted. He wasn't even announcing a new strategy to use his TV channel and his media to reach people who don't know Jesus. He was talking about winning the next presidential election. We're going to take this nation back for Jesus. How? Because we're going to get somebody elected. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to win an election. I would love it if the person who gets elected next loves Jesus and wants to see God's will done in the earth. Wouldn't that be incredible? I hope we can see leaders elected who love Jesus and want to see God's kingdom flourish. But here's what I believe is an obvious truth. Winning elections isn't the path to taking our nation back for Jesus. Winning elections is not the strategy that God has placed on the heart of His church. It's the same strategy that it's always been. People who know Jesus and are walking with Him, walking into dark places, going to places where the light of the gospel needs to be shined, and telling them the good news. Jesus has made a way. He's come to set us free. Sharing the news with anybody who will listen. That's the key to take our nation back for Jesus. But why did Jesus say people would hate the disciples? Was it because of their political activities? No. Was it because of the stances they took on the issues of their day? I don't really know. But I think it was because they preached the message of Jesus everywhere they went. They preached the message of Jesus even when people told them to be quiet. They preached the message of Jesus when all of hell stood in their face and threatened them with violence and threatened them with death. They ventured out all over the known world and took Jesus to dark and difficult places. And every one of those men that were standing there listening to Jesus that day lived out these words. Every single one of them. They were all persecuted because of their faith in Jesus. All of them were beaten because of Jesus. They were all persecuted because of their witness. And all of them endured great hardship and pain for the sake of the gospel. And all of them eventually gave their lives because of their witness of Jesus. Tanu and her family attend here, and they're from India. It's a wonderful story of how the gospel spread to India. Legend says that Thomas, one of the disciples, took the gospel to India. But while he was there sharing his faith, he was run through with a spear. He gave his life to share the gospel in a place that didn't know Jesus. And today, her family comes to a church and worships the Lord because of the willingness and the sacrifice of one of the early apostles. Here's what I want you to accept this morning. If you want to be ready for the last days, you must be willing to give your life for Jesus. You must be willing to give your life for Jesus. You say, wow, Pastor Brad, come on. This is intense. I got to be ready to die? Is that what you're saying? I got to be ready to die for my faith? Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. He said it. He said, at that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray each other and hate each other. Why would people turn away from the faith? Because it's not easy to serve Jesus. They turn away from the faith because of opposition and pain and hardship. They turn away from the faith because of danger. It's not easy to follow Jesus. This is not a new message that I'm preaching today, by the way. It's always been this way. Revelation 12, and they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death. They loved not their lives unto death. Another translation says they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Church, the living God, the freedom and the connection that we have with each other and with Jesus today in this church was paid for in the blood of the martyrs who've gone before us. They were willing to die for what they believed in. And this may sound like extremism, but it is not extremism. It's an utmost commitment to the love of God. We aren't called to argue and fight. We aren't called to control the systems of a fallen world. We're called to speak the truth in love and stay true to the Master no matter what it costs us. That's what the end time church will be. We've enjoyed a wonderful season of freedom and prosperity in America. It's been like nothing the earth has ever seen before, I believe. The idea of persecution is hard for us to wrap our minds around. After all, this country was built in part on religious freedom. But you know what? That's not true for the rest of the world. In 2021, 360 million Christians around the world suffered significant persecution for their faith. Many of them ran and went into hiding. Many of them lost all of their earthly possessions. That's 1 out of every 7 Christians on the earth. 1 in 7. More than 1 million Christians were martyred for their faith worldwide in the decade of the 2000s alone, from 2000 to 2010. 1 million Christians. In our 2,000-year history as a church, it's estimated that around 70 million people have given their lives, been killed for their faith. And did you know that over half of those, over 35 million, were martyred in the 20th century alone? That means that in the 100 years between 1900 and 2000, more people gave their lives for Jesus than in all of the rest of church history combined. The point is, the last thing that I want to see is persecution come to America. I don't want us to experience it the way the rest of the world has experienced it. But you know what? The handwriting's on the wall. Things are getting worse, not better. And I'm telling you this not to alarm you. I'm telling you this to prepare you. I want you to know that when the day comes, we have to be willing to stand for Jesus. The world hated the disciples because of Jesus. Why would it be any different for us? Today, we are hated by more groups for more different reasons than you can list. And the list just keeps growing. So here's the question. What will you do when persecution comes to your door? What will you do? Verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Wow. These words of Jesus can be a little hard to take and definitely hard to understand. You have to remember, Jesus started this conversation by talking about the temple. So a lot of what he's talking about here has to do with that time, those people, that point in history. Scholars agree that the passage in Daniel that he's referencing here, the abomination that causes desolation, is talking specifically about the destruction of the temple. Most Jews at that time wrongly believed that this has already happened because legend has it that Alexander the Great actually walked into the temple grounds and participated in offering a sacrifice. Another king after him is said to have set up a shrine to the god Zeus inside the Holy of Holies and actually sacrificed a pig on the temple grounds, which would have been very offensive and would have defiled the temple. So Jews thought that this had already happened at the time Jesus was saying this. But not too many years from the time he was speaking, the Jews would come to find out what the judgment of God truly looks like. They would see it firsthand. In 70 AD, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. They cut off the supply lines. They starved the people living there. It's said that the city descended into lawlessness as they were blockaded in. It was a desperate situation. Some of the Jews living in Jerusalem actually resorted to cannibalism. It's said that at least one mother actually ate her child. The temple was completely destroyed. It's reduced to utter rubble. And today we all know that an Islamic mosque sits on the Temple Mount. The abomination that causes desolation is still in effect to this day. The words of Jesus came true. In less than 40 years' time, most of the things that he had talked about in this particular passage in Matthew 24 happened. But some of those things are still to come. Some of the things he was talking about have not yet happened. And there's one very important question we have to consider today. This is the heart of this message. It's the reason why we need to talk about it. Why? Why? Why would God want to destroy his temple? Why would he want to destroy his own people? Why would he allow such terrible things to happen? Why? The answer to that question is something that Christians do not like to talk about today. We're uncomfortable with this idea. See, what we've done is we have renegotiated our view of God. We have turned Jesus into a Savior that makes sense to us, that appeases our sensibilities, that fits in our grid of what a God ought to be. But that's a huge mistake. I told you last week something I think everybody needs to hear. Salvation is not about Jesus accepting you as you are. Salvation is about accepting Jesus for who he is. And unless you accept Jesus for who he is and you humble yourself, you can't truly know the joy of salvation. It's like they used to say, either he's Lord of all or he's not Lord at all. You'll either accept him as he is or you'll reject him for who he is and try to turn him into something else that suits you. Why would God destroy his temple and his people? Because they rejected him. They rejected him. Jesus went to them. He healed the sick. He preached about the kingdom. He told them the way. He poured out his life. He gave of himself. And they rejected him, and then they had him killed. And you say, wait a minute, Pastor Brad. I thought that was all part of God's plan. You know, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whosoever would believe in him. Yeah, that's right. That was God's plan. They were participating in the plan that God had set in motion. But this is what we all need to see. God will judge the sin and rebellion of all of those who have rejected his son. He will judge the sin and rebellion of all of those who have rejected his son. He's holy and he's righteous, and he holds us to a standard that we can't even comprehend. Listen to me, judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. This world has rejected Jesus. The power structures of this world today are working tirelessly to defeat the cause of Christ. They are giving everything. They are paying huge dollars. They are working behind the scenes to subvert the will of God on the earth. And I want you to know, children of God, God will not abide by that rebellion. When you reject Jesus, the Son of God, you're headed for destruction. Make yourself ready. Make yourself ready. If you haven't done it yet, accept Jesus for who he is. Accept him. Give him your life. Lay down your life and call him Lord. Next week, I'm going to talk specifically about the rapture. But real quick, there's just one more thing I want you to see. We're going to jump down to verse 32. Now learn this from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. This passage in this text is a little problematic and confusing to a lot of people, because he says, he's speaking to a group of people and he says, this generation will not pass away. But if you read it with this cursory view and you assume that he's talking to them at that time, you'll miss what he's saying. It's just the opposite, actually. He says, as soon as the twigs get tender and the leaves come out, you'll know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you will know that it is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation, most scholars believe that could have been translated, this kind of generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. What's the point? We are living in the last days. I know that you're probably already convinced of it. I don't have to tell you. We all feel it. We can all see it. Every time we watch the news, we are faced with that realization even more. And what I want to tell you is this: make yourself ready. Hold on to Jesus. If there's ever been a message that the American church needs to hear today, this is it. Make yourself ready.